Every morning, millions of people wake up and check the silver price on their phones. They see a number. Today, that number is $72.48 per ounce. They look at it, they note it, and they move on with their day. They believe that number is real. They believe that if they wanted to buy silver today, $72.48 is what they would pay. They are wrong. The number on their screen is not the price of silver. It is the price of a promise. And right now, in 2026, that promise is quietly breaking apart. To understand how this happened, one must go back to the architecture of the modern silver market. Decades ago, financial exchanges in New York and London designed a system that would allow silver to be traded at massive scale without the inconvenience of actually moving physical metal from one place to another. The system was elegant in its logic. A buyer would purchase a futures contract on the COMEX exchange, which is operated by the CME Group in New York. That contract gave the buyer the legal right to receive 5,000 ounces of physical silver at a specific price on a specific future date. But here was the key assumption built into the entire system. Nobody would actually ask for the silver, and for decades, that assumption held perfectly. The banks did not want silver sitting in a warehouse. The hedge funds did not want silver. The speculators did not want silver. They wanted price exposure. They wanted to profit from the movement of the number on the screen. When their contracts expired, they simply rolled them forward, taking a cash settlement and letting the cycle repeat. The physical metal mostly stayed where it was. The paper market grew enormous. At its peak, the ratio of paper silver contracts to actual physical silver reached as high as 356 to 1. For every single physical ounce sitting in a COMEX vault, the exchange had issued 356 paper promises to deliver that same ounce to different buyers. This system did not collapse because everyone agreed, quietly and without discussion, to never test it. But in early January 2026, someone tested it. Between January 3rd and January 10 of this year, 33.45 million ounces of silver were physically withdrawn from COMEX warehouses for actual delivery in a single week. That represented 26% of the entire registered inventory, meaning the silver officially available for immediate delivery disappearing in just 7 days. These were not speculators rolling contracts. These were industrial manufacturers, solar panel producers, electronics firms, and technology companies who had finally understood that the supply chain was fracturing. They wanted the real metal. They wanted it in their hands, in their facilities, ready for production. And they were willing to stand at the COMEX counter and demand exactly what their contracts legally entitled them to receive. What was revealed in that single week was something the financial world had been quietly avoiding for years. COMEX registered silver inventory currently stands at approximately 82 million ounces. The open interest in silver futures contracts, meaning the total theoretical delivery obligation of the exchange, stands between 425 and 455 million ounces. The exchange has promised, in legally binding contracts, to deliver more than 5 times the silver it actually possesses. On January 29, 2026, silver touched $121.67 per ounce, a nominal all-time record. And then, within hours, it crashed 31 to 36% in one of the most violent commodity collapses in modern history. The CME Group raised margin requirements, triggering forced liquidations of leveraged paper positions. The paper price collapsed, but physical silver dealers in Tokyo and Dubai were simultaneously charging premiums of 60 to 80% above the COMEX spot price. Buyers in Japan were paying an effective price of $130 per ounce for real silver, while the exchange ticker displayed $71. Two prices, one metal, two completely different realities. The serious observer must sit with that fact for a moment. The same ounce of silver, depending on whether it exists as a contract on a screen or as a physical bar in a dealer's hand, carries two entirely different valuations separated by as much as 80%. That divergence is not a market inefficiency, it is a market fracture. And as the business community is now beginning to understand, fractures of this scale do not heal quietly. They announce themselves loudly. There is a question that serious analysts have been asking since late February 2026. A war broke out in the Middle East, a real war with missiles and strikes and burning infrastructure, and silver, the metal that every historical textbook says rises during geopolitical crisis, fell. It did not just dip, it collapsed. From 117 on February 28th to below $72 within weeks. Investors who had studied every precious metal cycle of the past century, who had positioned themselves perfectly for what they believed was an inevitable safe haven surge, watched their thesis get destroyed in real time. The question they keep asking is simple: how? The answer to that question is one of the most important economic lessons of 2026, and it begins not in a trading room in New York, but in a shipping lane in the Persian Gulf. On February 28, 2026, military operations commenced against Iranian targets. Within hours, oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which approximately 13 million barrels of oil pass every single day, began receiving emergency advisories. Shipping companies activated war risk protocols. Marine insurance premiums for vessels transiting anywhere near the conflict zone spiked to levels not seen since the height of the Houthi attacks in 2024 and 2025. Captains began rerouting, cargo began backing up. The world's most critical maritime choke point was no longer functioning as a reliable artery of global commerce. Most people think about the Strait of Hormuz in terms of oil. They are missing the larger picture. Silver moves through global supply chains in forms that most people never consider. It travels as refined 1,000-ounce bars from Mexican and Peruvian smelters to Asian manufacturing hubs. It moves as industrial grain and powder from European refiners to semiconductor fabrication plants in Taiwan and South Korea. It flows through freight networks that depend on stable insurance markets, predictable transit routes, and functioning port operations across the Middle East and Asia. When those networks seized up in late February and March of 2026, industrial silver users in Asia faced something they had not experienced before. Not a price problem, a availability problem. The metal they needed to keep their factories running was simply not arriving on schedule. And here is where the story becomes genuinely counterintuitive. When silver users cannot get physical metal through normal supply channels, they do not stop buying, they start paying more. The premiums in Shanghai, already elevated at $5 to $10 above COMEX futures before the war, widened further as Asian manufacturers began competing aggressively for whatever physical silver remained accessible in regional markets. Dealers in Dubai, sitting at the geographic intersection of East and West, found themselves handling frantic procurement requests from industrial buyers who had never previously approached physical bullion markets directly. Premiums in the UAE climbed to 40% above COMEX spot. In Japan, secondary market premiums touched 60%. Meanwhile, in New York and London, the paper market was telling a completely different story. This is the macro override mechanism, and understanding it is essential for any serious decision-maker watching the silver market in 2026. When war breaks out and oil prices surge, inflation expectations rise immediately. Rising inflation expectations cause bond markets to sell off, pushing Treasury yields higher. When Treasury yields rise faster than inflation expectations, the real yield, meaning the return an investor receives after accounting for inflation, turns positive or climbs sharply. And when real yields climb, the opportunity cost of holding non-yielding assets like silver and gold becomes punishing. Institutional investors, particularly those running leveraged positions in precious metals, futures that they had built during silver's extraordinary 2025 rally, faced a brutal calculation. Hold and absorb the carry cost of rising yields, or liquidate and move into yield-bearing assets. The majority liquidated. The result was a cascade. Paper silver positions were sold. Prices fell. Margin calls triggered more forced selling. Prices fell further. Trading volume in COMEX silver futures and options combined sank by 60% compared to the first 2 months of the year, according to Bullion Vault research. Giant silver-backed ETFs began shrinking as institutional holders redeemed shares. The paper market was experiencing one of its most severe liquidations in history, and at the exact same moment, on the other side of the world, factory procurement managers were paying 40 to 80% premiums to secure the physical metal that the paper market was simultaneously crashing. But there is one dimension of the war's impact on silver that almost no mainstream analyst has reported clearly. Defense electronics. Every precision-guided munition contains silver. Every advanced radar system, every communications array, every electronic warfare component deployed in an active conflict zone consumes silver in quantities that defense contractors do not publicize. When military operations commenced in February 2026, defense procurement orders for electronic components surged across the United States, Israel, and allied nations. Those components require silver, and those orders do not go through COMEX futures contracts. They go through direct industrial procurement at whatever price is necessary to meet the delivery schedule. The war, in other words, was simultaneously crashing the paper price and accelerating the physical consumption that was already emptying the vaults. This is the paradox that serious business leaders must sit with carefully. The number on the screen fell because of the war. The actual shortage worsened because of the war. Both things are true at the same time. And the gap between them, the distance between what the screen says and what the physical market demands, is not closing, it is widening. Every week that the conflict continues is another week of disrupted supply chains, elevated industrial premiums, accelerating defense consumption, and frozen shipping routes. The paper price says $72. The war says something else entirely. There is a date that almost nobody in the mainstream financial media is talking about. It is not a Federal Reserve meeting date. It is not an earnings season deadline. It is not an election. It is July 13th, 2026. And for anyone who understands what that date represents, it is arguably the single most consequential deadline in the global silver market today, because on that date, the Trump administration must report back on whether its negotiations to secure American access to critical minerals, including silver, have succeeded. And if they have not, the legal machinery to reshape every silver trade on the planet is fully loaded, legally authorized, and waiting for one's signature. To understand how America arrived at this moment, one must go back further than most analysts are willing to go. In April 2025, President Trump signed Executive Order 14272, directing the Department of Commerce to open a formal Section 232 investigation into processed critical minerals and their derivative products. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 is a national security statute. It gives the President of the United States the legal authority to impose tariffs, import restrictions, and trade barriers on any imported product that the Commerce Secretary formally determines poses a threat to American national security. Trump had previously used Section 232 to impose tariffs on steel, aluminum, and copper. Now he was turning that same legal weapon toward the mineral supply chains that power the modern economy. The investigation ran for 6 months. On October 24, 2025, the Commerce Secretary submitted his findings to the President. The conclusions were striking in their directness. The United States is fully import dependent for 12 critical minerals. It relies on imports for more than half of its consumption of an additional 29 minerals. Silver was explicitly named on the updated 2025 critical minerals list, one of 60 minerals designated as vital to the American economy and national security due to significant supply chain vulnerabilities. The investigation found that this level of import dependence, particularly given China's dominance over global refining capacity, represented a direct and quantifiable threat to American industrial and defense production capability. On January 14, 2026, Trump acted, but not in the way markets expected. Presidential Proclamation 11,001 did not impose immediate tariffs on silver imports. Instead, it instructed U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick to negotiate bilateral agreements with partner nations to secure adequate American supplies of processed critical minerals. It gave those negotiators exactly 180 days. It set a hard reporting deadline of July 13, 2026, and it explicitly reserved, in the legal language of the proclamation itself, the President's right to impose tariffs, import restrictions, and minimum import price floors if those negotiations failed to produce satisfactory outcomes. The financial press reported this as Trump holding off on tariffs. They missed the more important story entirely. What Trump actually did on January 14th was point a loaded weapon at the global silver trade and tell the world he would pull the trigger in 180 days if he did not get what he wanted. The question serious analysts must ask is not whether Trump delayed. The question is what he is negotiating for and what happens to the global silver market depending on whether he gets it or not. Consider the specific geography of this negotiation. The United States does not mine enough silver domestically to supply its own industrial needs. American silver mine production covers only a fraction of total consumption. The major silver-supplying nations that Trump's team is now negotiating with include Mexico, the world's largest silver-producing country Peru, the second largest Australia, Canada, and Chile. These are not adversarial nations. They are American allies and trade partners. The negotiation framework is real, and the bilateral discussions are active. But China is the variable that no bilateral agreement with Mexico or Peru can fully solve. China controls an estimated 60 to 70% of global refined silver exports. It dominates the processing and refining infrastructure that converts raw silver ore into the industrial-grade metal that technology manufacturers actually need. And on January 1, 2026, precisely 13 days before Trump signed Proclamation 11,001, China implemented its own unilateral action. Beijing introduced strict new export licensing requirements for refined silver, effectively ring-fencing the majority of its refined silver output for domestic industrial use. Only large state-approved companies, meeting a minimum annual production threshold of 80 tons, could qualify for export licenses. Hundreds of smaller and mid-sized Chinese exporters, who had long supplied global markets, were immediately cut off. The timing of these two moves, China's export restrictions on January 1st and Trump's critical minerals proclamation on January 14th, was not coincidental. These were opening moves in a strategic competition over mineral supply chains that both governments understand will define industrial and military capability for the next generation. China moved first to secure its domestic supply. Trump moved second to secure America's access to everyone else's supply. The global silver market is now caught between these two competing national strategies. And sitting in the middle of this geopolitical chess match is 434 million ounces of silver. That is the quantity currently held in warehouses linked to the COMEX Futures Exchange in New York, approximately 100 million ounces more than a year ago. This silver was imported into the United States and deliberately parked inside American warehouses by traders and industrial users who feared that Trump's tariff threat might slam the door shut on future imports. It was a rational hedge. If tariffs arrive, the silver already inside America avoids them. But that rational hedge has created a deeply irrational market outcome. 434 million ounces of silver is sitting locked inside American warehouses, unavailable to the London dealers who need it, unavailable to the Asian manufacturers who need it, unavailable to the global industrial supply chain that is running on empty. Rona O'Connell, senior analyst at StoneX Group, described this situation with surgical precision. She noted that while these inventories exist, there is likely to be significant resistance to any silver movement out of the United States as long as the critical minerals tariff threat remains live. The metal is physically present in enormous quantities, but it is functionally frozen, trapped by the uncertainty of a deadline that is now less than 100 days away. What happens on July 13th matters enormously. If Trump's negotiators return with genuine bilateral agreements securing American silver supply from allied mining nations, the tariff threat may recede, the frozen inventories may begin flowing again, and the paper-physical divergence may begin to narrow. If negotiations stall, if China refuses to modify its export restrictions as part of any broader trade framework, if the war in the Middle East continues disrupting the supply chains that move silver from mine to manufacturer, Trump faces a binary choice. Accept continued vulnerability in a metal his own Commerce Secretary called a national security threat, or pull the trigger on import restrictions that would permanently reshape how silver moves around the world. For the business community watching this situation, the July 13th deadline is not an abstract policy date. It is the moment when the uncertainty that has been suppressing rational market pricing of physical silver either resolves or escalates. And in a market already running 820 million ounces below cumulative supply over 5 years, with COMEX registered inventories 75% below their 2020 peak, with Chinese refining capacity effectively nationalized for domestic use, the escalation scenario carries consequences that extend far beyond the price of a silver coin. It reaches into the cost of every solar panel, every semiconductor, every electric vehicle, and every defense system that the modern economy depends upon. The deadline is July 13th. The decision belongs to one man, and the world is watching. Part 4. What serious decision makers must understand now. The strategic implications for business, industry, and capital allocation. There is a particular kind of investor, a particular kind of business leader who looks at a falling price and sees only one thing: a bargain. They see silver at $72 on the screen, they remember it was $121 just weeks ago, and they begin calculating entry points. They are asking the wrong question entirely. The right question is not where the paper price is going. The right question is whether the paper price is still a reliable measure of anything at all. And for the serious decision maker trying to navigate the most complex commodity market of the decade, the answer to that question should fundamentally change how they think about silver, about supply chain risk, and about the hidden costs building inside their own businesses right now. Begin with the number that every entrepreneur and business leader in manufacturing, technology, and energy needs to internalize immediately: 820 million ounces. That is the cumulative silver supply deficit since 2021. 5 consecutive years in which global demand exceeded global mine production. 5 consecutive years in which the shortfall was covered by drawing down above-ground stockpiles that had accumulated over decades. Those stockpiles are now largely gone. COMEX registered inventories are 75% below their 2020 peak. LBMA vaults in London hold 40% less silver than they did just a few years ago. Shanghai inventories have fallen to their lowest level in a decade. The buffer that allowed the market to absorb annual deficits without triggering visible price dislocations has been consumed. What comes next is not a buffer problem. It is a structural problem. And structural problems do not resolve themselves on a quarterly earnings timeline. For business leaders whose companies use silver as an industrial input, the strategic implication is direct and urgent. The era of treating silver as a stable, predictably priced commodity input is over. Every company that manufactures solar panels, electric vehicles, semiconductors, medical devices, 5G infrastructure components, or defense electronics must now approach silver procurement the way energy companies approach oil procurement in a geopolitically unstable region, with strategic reserves, with long-term supply agreements, with diversified sourcing relationships that do not depend on a single refining geography that can be shut off by a government decree on January 1st of any given year. The solar industry is perhaps the most exposed sector and the least prepared for what is coming. By 2025, the solar sector was consuming between 200 and 250 million ounces of silver annually, roughly 1/5 of total global production. The next generation of high-efficiency solar cell technology, the TOPCon and HJT designs that are rapidly replacing older models, requires significantly more silver per unit than the technology it is replacing. Solar manufacturers are simultaneously scaling production capacity at the fastest rate in history and increasing their silver intensity per unit. They are running directly into a supply wall at accelerating speed. The companies in this sector that survive the coming supply crunch will be the ones that secured long-term physical supply agreements in 2026, before July 13th, before the tariff decision, before the next phase of the shortage becomes impossible to paper over. For entrepreneurs and investors evaluating capital allocation, the paper-physical divergence itself carries a lesson that extends beyond silver. What the silver market is demonstrating in 2026 is that paper instruments, futures contracts, ETF shares, and derivative positions can diverge catastrophically from the physical assets they claim to represent when the underlying supply becomes genuinely constrained. This is not a new phenomenon in financial history. It happened in the rare earth market. It happened in the lithium market during the electric vehicle build-out. It happened with semiconductors during the COVID supply chain crisis. In each case, the companies that had secured physical supply before the crisis absorbed the disruption. The companies that were relying on financial instruments to manage their commodity exposure discovered that those instruments could not be converted into actual material when actual material was what their production lines required. The COMEX delivery situation makes this lesson particularly acute right now. The exchange holds 82 million ounces of registered, immediately deliverable silver against theoretical delivery obligations of 425 to 455 million ounces. Even the most conservative analysts acknowledge that if 20% of open interest holders simultaneously demanded physical delivery, the exchange could not fulfill its obligations with available inventory. The implications for any business or investment portfolio holding paper, silver instruments as a proxy for physical exposure deserve serious reconsideration. A contract that settles in cash when physical delivery becomes impossible does not protect a manufacturer who needs 100,000 ounces of silver to keep a production line running. It gives them a cash profit while their factory sits idle. Bank of America analysts have projected silver could reach $309 per ounce. Silver mining companies are pricing their equity at an implied silver price of $122 per ounce, more than 60% above today's COMEX spot. The gold-to-silver ratio at 65-1 remains historically elevated, flagging silver as structurally undervalued relative to gold at current prices. These are not the assessments of fringe commentators. They are the published research outputs of institutional analysts working from the same supply deficit data, the same COMEX inventory figures, and the same Chinese export restriction documents that any serious researcher can access and verify independently. 3 scenarios now define the forward path for silver and for every business decision connected to it. In the first scenario, Trump's negotiators return before July 13th with genuine bilateral supply agreements from Mexico, Peru, Australia, and Canada. China moderates its export restrictions as part of a broader trade framework. The war in the Middle East moves toward resolution. Shipping lanes normalize. The 434 million ounces frozen in American warehouses begin flowing again toward global industrial users. The paper-physical divergence narrows. Silver reprices somewhere between $85 and $100 as the structural deficit reasserts itself without the additional pressure of geopolitical disruption. In the second scenario, negotiations produce partial agreements that satisfy some supply concerns but leave China's export restrictions intact. The war continues at a managed level of intensity without full escalation or resolution. The July 13th deadline passes with targeted rather than sweeping tariff measures. The physical shortage continues tightening gradually. Industrial users face rising procurement costs. The paper price slowly catches upward toward the physical reality. Silver moves toward $100 to $120 over the following 2 quarters, as the deficit math becomes impossible to ignore. In the third scenario, negotiations fail to produce meaningful outcomes before July 13th. Trump imposes broad import restrictions on processed critical minerals. The 434 million ounces in American warehouses become functionally locked inside the United States. Global markets outside America face an acute silver shortage with no available buffer. The war escalates, or a new supply chain disruption compounds the existing shortage. Physical premiums in Asia and Europe surge beyond anything recorded in modern market history. The COMEX faces a delivery stress event that forces emergency rule changes. Silver reprices violently toward the $150 to $200 range that inflation-adjusted historical precedent from the 1980 Hunt Brothers episode would suggest is theoretically possible in a genuine physical squeeze. The serious decision-maker does not need to predict which scenario unfolds. They need to build a strategy that is rational across all 3. That means securing physical silver supply agreements now, before the July 13th deadline resolves the uncertainty in either direction. It means auditing every paper silver instrument in a portfolio for counterparty risk and delivery reliability. It means understanding which production inputs and which supply chains carry hidden silver exposure that has not yet been priced into operational cost models. And it means recognizing that the $72 number on the screen is not a price. It is a temporary artifact of a paper system under structural stress in a market where the physical reality has already moved somewhere else entirely. The war did not create this problem. The war revealed it. Trump's deadline did not create this problem. Trump's deadline is a response to it. The problem was created over 5 consecutive years of consuming more silver than the world could mine and financing the difference with paper promises that are now being called in, one delivery notice at a time. The screen says $72. The vaults tell a different story, and for anyone making serious financial or operational decisions in 2026, it is the vaults that deserve their full attention.